We're very happy to welcome you to the International Inequalities Institute and its 10th anniversary conference, which is called the III at 10, New Directions in Inequality Research. And we're looking forward to the 2 days very much. We have two great keynotes, one with Professor Leslie McCall, which is going to begin in a few minutes. And tomorrow we have Professor Thomas Piketty. We have a plenary panel this afternoon with on new directions in inequality research. We have 24 parallel sessions. 2 of those are panel sessions. The others have 65 contributed papers being featured across those sessions, selected out of 167 submissions. So we're very pleased. We here at all of us at the Institute are really happy to host you for this. We think 10 years is not a very long time, but the Institute has grown quite a bit. There's now 25 of us, 25 in-house researchers at the III, from research assistants to full professors, as well as our real main asset and sort of wealth, which is an array of faculty associates across departments of the LSE. This group of people work along sort of 4 research programs, dedicated research programs, a global inequality observatory, and 4 research networks. And all of those different streams are represented in this conference. So the program was set up so that there's representation from all of those different streams of work across many disciplines in the social sciences at the conference. Obviously, we also have a wonderful professional service staff team. We have the FC fellowship program, and I think in your bag there's a little leaflet about the FC program. So we're delighted to have you all here for that. The conference is about new directions, and so since I had 15 minutes, and so as not to just say welcome and goodbye, I thought I'd just say 3 things that I think are in my head as big questions. All of you are coming here with lots of ideas for what should be the new directions in inequality research. I want to just raise 3 challenges that I think are faces and are important and are, at least in my mind. One is the quest for robustness in measurement. So if you go and Google inequality, whatever, the share of the top 10% or the Gini coefficient in some country on the web, you'll find respected databases that we all trust that say completely different things. And that's even more true for wealth than it is for income. And we measure mobility in 100 different ways. And some of that is right because we want to measure different things, but there is an array of data sources and methods, some of which are justifiable, some of which are not, but which say very different things. So what we actually know about some of the basics in inequality today, no longer that clear. Some of that is actually an odd kind of progress in that we've learned that we were wrong about certain things, but we don't yet quite know what the right answer is. So I think this is one challenge. Another is the link between inequality and authoritarian populism, right? So the rise of authoritarian populism is a civilizational challenge probably of our times. God knows what kind of wars it will lead to. They're already here. There may be more. It's a great, enormous challenge for all of us, on a par with climate change. And everybody knows it's linked to inequality. And everybody says, oh, inequality is linked to that. But the link is not linear or straightforward or extremely easy. Some people argue that some of the reactions are actually a backlash not to more inequality, but to some reductions in inequality, say across genders or races in certain countries, which generate responses. So the links, the nature of the link between inequality and the rise of authoritarian populism is, I think, a question that behooves many of us, and I know that a number of you are working on those things. And finally, a challenge that's very dear to us here at the III, it's part of our DNA, part of our genetic imprint here is multidisciplinarity. And we do have people from across disciplines trying to work together. But interdisciplinarity, which is, I guess, the step after multidisciplinarity, is a real challenge, right? Everybody pays lip service to it. Everybody says they love it. The funders say they love it. Those of us who are trying to do it realize it's actually extremely hard to do. In part for reasons to do with the fact that the publication reward structure and the incentives are not set up for multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary work. But it goes deeper than that. You know, there are sort of epistemological differences in how people treat the subject across these disciplines. So I think that's a challenge, you know, and I'd like us in this conference to think, can we go beyond the lip service and towards the holy grail of interdisciplinary? So those are my three things that I'm thinking about for this conference, but I'm sure you'll have many others. So I just want to make finally just three very practical points for the conference. One quite important one is, in the program, you'll see that some of the parallel sessions have chairs, but they're a minority. Most of them don't have an assigned chair, and the protocol there is, as standard for many of us in conferences we go to, is that the last speaker listed in the program is the chair and timekeeper. Okay, so if your name is the third one on the parallel session, please chair the session, which just means keep people to time, basically. And the time is 30 minutes per paper, including questions, whether those questions are during the presentation or after. But at the end of each 30 minutes, we move on to the next paper. Please, I ask you all to please try to keep to starting and end times. Nothing annoys me more than a conference that rambles on forever. So there are certain times you're going to start at the right time, end your coffee break, go to the session, and it'll end at the right time, hopefully. Okay. On location, so the first keynote and this afternoon's panel are here in this room. The parallel sessions across the 2 days are on the first and second floor of this building. Dinner this evening is across the street in the old building on the 5th floor. This is all in your program, but I'm just giving you. And tomorrow's keynote and closing reception is at another building, which is also in your program. That's the only one that's in another real building. That's like 4 or 5 minutes away. So walk there. I'd like to thank my colleagues, a number of whom are here, from the program committee and from the organizing committee. And I'd like to thank many people in person and by name for their help in organizing this conference, without whom the conference would not work. But I'm going to do that in the closing reception rather than now. So now I just want to thank you again for coming. Some of you have come from far away. I hope you'll enjoy the conference. And with that, let me hand over to Professor Fran Tonkiss, who will chair the first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Chico. Welcome all to the LSE for this keynote lecture for the II at 10 conference. My name is Fran Tonkiss, and I'm a professor of sociology here at the LSE. And it's my very great pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Leslie McCall, both to our online audience and to the audience here with us in this auditorium. Leslie McCall is Presidential Professor of Political Science and Sociology at CUNY and Associate Director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, also at CUNY. Professor McCall researches, as you will know, public opinion on inequality, opportunity, and related economic and policy issues, trends in earnings and family income inequality, and patterns of intersectional inequality. She is author of The Undeserving Rich: American Beliefs about Inequality, Opportunity, and Redistribution. This event, as Chico has said, is part of the III at 10, New Directions in Inequality Research, which is celebrating over the next 2 days, amazingly, the 10th anniversary of the International Inequalities Institute. This lecture will be recorded, and we hope that it will be made available on the III's YouTube channel, technical matters permitting. Professor McCall will speak for around 40 minutes, and then we will go up to the remainder of the hour with a chance for all of your questions. But for now, let me welcome Professor Leslie McCall.
Okay. I thought this might be a little bit easier for me, Chico, because I'm closer to the mic. Everyone can hear me all right? Okay, great. So thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Professor Ferreira, for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. And also thank you, Professor Tonkiss, for the introduction. It's extremely exciting to be here and to participate in this celebration, which is a very well-deserved celebration. 10 years, it's a phenomenal center. You've been a leader globally in this kind of work. I know that as someone who's also been involved in a center myself on inequality, and we always look towards the eye. I think you guys might have been the first center that was really oriented around contemporary rise in inequality and related forms of inequality. And just the response that you received for the call for this conference is phenomenal. I'm really looking forward to all the papers that are going to be presented later on today and tomorrow. I also just want to quickly thank the people who were involved in setting this up, Peter and Emma in the comms team, and Stella, who is involved in organizing the conference. Really very much appreciate all the help that you gave me in preparing for this. So I also really appreciated the 3 areas that Professor Ferreira mentioned. I think that this one will contribute at least to the first one on measurement, even though it doesn't look that way. It's very much about measurement, as you'll see. Okay, so if we, is this going to, this one? Is this one going to work now? Okay, great. Okay. So I am going to present for most of the talk. I'm going to be, especially the last half, I'm going to be presenting a work in progress, a paper in progress. And then for the first half, I will be presenting some work from prior published work that's very much related to the unpublished work that I'm going to be presenting for the rest of the talk. I'm very fortunate to be collaborating with Arvid Lind on many of these projects, including the work in progress. And then a group of amazing scholars here in the second kind of bullet point, I won't mention them all, are involved as co-authors and collaborators on this work in progress, spanning every continent. And as you'll see, they've also been involved in helping to field some of the new questions that we've developed for this work. And then I'm also drawing on earlier work with other collaborators as well. Okay, so the motivation for this talk is really straightforward. We know that labor compensation is a major source of income for most people, at least in high and middle income countries. And we also know that labor market institutions such as corporations, unions, other kinds of regulatory regimes are fundamental in shaping levels of inequality, especially, of course, in labor compensation, by which I mean wages and earnings and other kinds of benefits that are derived from employment. Yet, research on preferences for reducing inequality focuses predominantly, I would say even overwhelmingly, but not only, for sure, not only, but predominantly on preferences for government redistribution through the tax and transfer system. And so you can see this predominant approach in panel A of this graph, which is something that is going to be guiding this work. So we call this a 2-part approach. And the reason why we call it a 2-part approach is because for the most part, the analysis focuses on whether people support government redistribution or not, right? One or the other. And we have here, for those who do support government redistribution, that's in the gray, the dark gray pie slice on the left. And the size of the slice there is a little bit less than 50%. That is to symbolize or reflect the share, roughly the share of people in the US who support government redistribution, according to the main question that's used in the literature to assess support for government redistribution. And there are measurement issues with that question. And so that's partly what I was referring to earlier, and that's partly what I'm going to get into in this talk. But roughly speaking, that's about the share. And in the US, even though this work is going to be cross-national, there is going to be a focus on the US, especially in the beginning, but actually throughout. But we're going to be looking at it in comparative perspective. And then you'll also see that there are several other countries that actually are quite similar to the US. But this sort of less than 50% share that's for government has really motivated a huge literature that asks about why Americans don't support government redistribution in larger numbers, given such high levels of inequality in the US, okay? Then there's the second part, which is those who do not support government redistribution. And that's in the light gray slice. There's a dotted dashed line around the perimeter there, because for us, that indicates the fact that this is a residual and it is open to interpretation. And that's our focus. We are very interested in this residual and what that means. Maybe indirectly, it will result in some insight on why people don't support government redistribution in larger number, but we are principally interested in this residual. And the main interpretation of that residual is that individuals are responsible for their economic standing themselves. Okay, so we refer to this as the individual responsibility versus government responsibility for reducing inequality. And that responsibility terminology, we're not really wedded to that. We're not fully wedded to that. We've been thinking about changing it, but it's based on the primary question that's asked in this literature, and I'm going to show that later, which asks whether government is responsible for reducing income differences between the rich and the poor, okay? And then individual responsibility obviously very much characterizes this ideology around individualism. But then this residual also could mean that people just simply accept inequality. Maybe they accept inequality because they think it's individuals' responsibility. But also importantly for us, we believe hidden in this residual is also an assumption that people believe in free market principles and therefore do not believe that there should be interventions in the marketplace to reduce market earnings and wage inequality. We're really going to focus on that piece as well. So a lot of stuff like that's in this residual, we're going to be trying to disentangle. Now, for the proposed three-part typology, if you look at panel B, we're going to be introducing a third possible option besides government responsibility and individual responsibility, and that's market responsibility. And by market responsibility, I want to be very clear, we don't mean free market. We don't mean, the invisible hand. We don't mean deregulation. We actually mean the opposite. So we refer to the market as the sphere in which there will be some form of or some set of policies that are targeted towards reducing economic inequality in wages and earnings. So in panel B, we have the option here where that option, or we have the possibility here where that option is actually very small. It doesn't really alter the two-part approach. And so we can see that that is pretty much held intact and should be a fine way to continue to do research. Let me also say we don't have it here in this chart, but another possible scenario is that support for government responsibility and support for market responsibility are overlapping, perfectly overlapping, so that one predicts the other. So we don't need to have this other option of market because we understand fully what people think through the government option. Now in panel C, what we have is a scenario in which a larger share supports market responsibility. And this maybe doesn't cut so much into the government responsibility portion, but does reduce this residual that we assume to be about individual responsibility, acceptance of inequality, and belief in free market principles. And then just let me note that we think of, because individual responsibility is the main interpretation of the residual, we think of the government and the market options as being both institutional options. So together, we group those together as institutional options and institutional responsibility versus individual responsibility. Okay, so just to boil this down to exactly what we're interested in, and we've also been playing with this terminology, which is the neoliberal public hypothesis. And the neoliberal public hypothesis is that the reason why there continue to be high levels of inequality, for example, in the US, and lack of support for redistribution, is because this is what people desire. This is what people demand. It's a demand side explanation. And I call this a neoliberal. It could be a liberal, market liberal public hypothesis, but the idea is that individuals support that, not just neoliberal elites, but the public supports it. And that what goes together under neoliberalism or market liberalism is that small states go with free markets. Those two are melded together. And so we're trying to disentangle those two with respect to public perceptions. So we're suggesting that just because people do not support the government redistribution option does not mean that they accept inequality, individual responsibility, and the free market. All right. So in terms of our data, we're using the primary sources of data that are used in this literature, the General Social Survey in the US and the International Social Survey Program internationally. We have just a few years that we're working with here. 2014 was when we first fielded, you'll see our first set of questions, new questions, but those were only fielded in the US and in Sweden and in Denmark. In 2021, we were able to get these questions on the full ISSP. So we have on the social inequality module, so we have 34 countries that are represented in those data. We've also conducted survey experiments in the US with the time sharing experiments in the social sciences. That's TESS, abbreviated as TESS. I'm not going to talk about that, but they're those results are very consistent with what I'm going to present. And I'm happy to talk more about those experiments in the Q&A. In terms of our methods, mainly what we're doing is we're developing very controlled comparisons between new questions and existing widely used questions and on the best existing surveys these are probability-based representative surveys in every single country. So they're very high quality surveys, but there's very limited space. So just remember, we only have a few questions to construct in order to be able to field them on these surveys. Most of what I'm going to show you is going to be descriptive, but we have lots of robustness checks. More than happy to talk about those. Everything holds up in those analyses. Our findings, quote unquote, are fairly substantial effect size wise. So the statistical significance is less important, but it certainly exists. And as I said, we've had survey experiments. And then let me just lastly note that, of course, there's a deductive part to this framework. Surely we are all coming from similar theoretical models, whether it's the median voter model or power resource theory or welfare state regimes theory. All of those kind of emphasize government redistribution. But there's also an inductive side to this where we're interested in knowing what people actually think rather than what they should think. And so I just also want to make sure that I say that we don't a priori have any, we're not trying to make an argument that supporting the market or government, one or the other, is better. Like that's not, we're not necessarily taking a normative position on this, but we are interested to try to better understand measurement-wise what people actually think. Okay, so our first strategy is what we call the parallel items approach. And this table shows our framework that informs the design of our questions. So what we have here are two columns that indicate the agents of redistribution or the agents of policies that would reduce inequality. And then in the rows, we have the target of the policies, which are in the cells. So the policies themselves are in the cells. The targets of those policies are in the rows. So the target could be reducing labor market income. typically we're focusing on wages and earnings, or the target could be reducing disposable income inequality. And so the conventional or the typical existing approach is to look at policies that are in cell D. And then what we're doing is looking at the diametrically opposed cell. So cell A. So in cell D, we have government actors. And the focus is, the target is of those policies is to reduce inequality in disposable income. Whereas in our first set of questions, we're going to look at private actors and their the policies potentially that can be used to reduce inequality in labor income. Now, we know we're conflating agents and targets in this particular exercise, but we're going to disentangle those in the next set of questions that we look at. All right, so this is the main question that is asked in the US. It's nice because it's pretty detailed, but that means, again, it is packaging a number of different dimensions. That's kind of a weakness, and we can't identify exactly which dimension is affecting responses. But nonetheless, it does provide a kind of holistic approach to understanding or laying out the issue of inequality. So here we have the actor is government. Some people think that the government ought to reduce income differences. Income differences is the target. So income differences between the rich and the poor. And then the policies themselves are raising the taxes of wealthy families or giving income assistance to the poor. Others think the government should not concern itself with reducing these income differences, and it's measured on a 7-point scale. And then unfortunately, the formatting got all messed up here, but this is the new question that we created to be parallel to the original and existing question. So we've substituted major companies for government as the main actor and institution, pay differences between employees with high pay and those with low pay as the main target. And then the policies would be to reduce the pay of executives or increase the pay of unskilled workers. This is a little fuzzy too, sorry about that. So I will read this. Yeah, I'm not sure you can see that at all, but I'll give you the bottom line. It's a 2x2 table, just looking at percentage distributions here. And we fielded this in 2014. That's in panel B at the bottom. And then the most recent panel in 2021. And essentially what you see is that in 2021, there's actually quite a similar share that supports market responsibility, and separately the total share that supports government responsibility. So government responsibility is 57% and market responsibility is 59%. And then in 2014, which I think is probably a more typical representation, I'll tell you why in a moment, but you have a more stark difference between those two figures. So 56% support market responsibility versus 47% that support government responsibility. The reason why the 57% and this is in the US in 2021 might be a little high is because these questions were fielded during COVID. But nonetheless, we have a greater share that is supporting market responsibility than is supporting government responsibility. This is also true for a little less than a quarter of all the countries in our 34 country sample. And among the countries that also have a greater share supporting market responsibility than supporting government responsibility are all the Anglo countries in the sample. So that would be Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, and the US. And then we also have 4 other countries. So Switzerland, France. France is a really interesting outlier in our results. You'll see in a moment. Iceland and Denmark as well. And I think there are reasons for those that we'll get into. Okay, so this is the residual. Let me just spend another minute on this. So usually the residual, remember, are those people who are not supporting government redistribution. So in the top panel, that would be 43% by the standard measures. But when you look at the share that oppose both government and market responsibility, it's only 28%. So that's a substantial decline in that residual from 43 to 28% that supposedly would be supporting an individual responsibility approach. That difference is much larger in 2014. It goes from 54% down to 34%. probably, I've looked at the trends in the 2020s, and it does look like the support for government redistribution is going back a little bit to what it was in 2014. And then finally, note that there is a strong overlap among those who support government responsibility and market responsibility, but it's not perfect. Okay, so there's definitely room there for people to only support government responsibility and not market, and vice versa. But again, it's not a one-to-one relationship. All right, so now our next strategy and our last strategy, so the rest of the talk will be about these questions, and this is the focus of our working paper. We call this the forced choice approach, because we're going to have one question that is a forced choice question, which is about the institutions and actors, and then we will get to policy preferences, which will be separate questions. All right, so this is the question. And this is something we fielded in the survey experiments in 2015 in the US, and also then on the full set of countries in the 2019 and to 2021. I say 2019 to 2021. Many of you may know the ISSP, especially because of COVID, it was fielded in different years in different countries. In the US, it was mostly 2021, late 2020 to 2021. So the question goes like this: from the following list, who do you think should have the greatest responsibility for reducing differences in income between people with high incomes and people with low incomes? And then we have these 6 options. I want to note that in 2015, when we did the survey experiments, we were able to randomize the first 5 options. The 6th option, which is income differences do not need to be reduced, that was always the last option. But we were able to randomize, so we have results of randomizing the category order, response category order. And then also we use charities instead of unions when we fielded it in the US in 2015. And that's because a lot of people say, oh, Americans support helping the poor, but only through nonprofits. Okay, but we found that hardly anyone selected charities as the main group that should reduce inequality in the US. Okay, so we have these 6 options. We're going to group them like this. We're going to put the private companies, the trade unions, and high-income individuals into the market responsibility bucket. This is the 3-part typology. So those would be in the market responsibility bucket. I know people are going to have questions about high-income individuals. But I can answer that in the Q&A. We've done a lot of robustness checks. It doesn't really matter whether we put the high-income individuals in the individual responsibility or in the market responsibility bucket, because there's a relatively small share of people who select that option. And then government will be the government responsibility option, and then low-income individuals. You can't really see it here, but the low-income individuals and no need to reduce inequality, those are the light gray, and that's marking individual responsibility. So this is what the mapping looks like for the forced choice outcomes and the 3-part typology there on the right. So this is the results from on the left. The lowest share of people selecting the government responsibility option at 38% is the US. But a number of other countries that I mentioned earlier that also had a greater share selecting market, the greater share that said that they supported market responsibility in the parallel items approach than supported government responsibility. You see the other Anglo countries like New Zealand and Australia, not Great Britain. I will come back to that in a moment. But Switzerland turned out to be very similar to the US, and France turned out to be, like I said, an outlier with fairly low levels of support for government redistribution, although we have some ideas for why that's the case. Now, the residual. So probably unsurprisingly, because I'm giving this talk, the individual responsibility options were not very popular. Most people did not select those when it came to the residual. Most people selected the other options for market responsibility. And then the numbers that I have in the red bars, those are actually just the share that selected the private companies option. So most people, as I said, most people supported or selected the private companies option among the market responsibility options. Very few selected the high income people, but in certain countries, the unions option, and I think the countries were the countries with strong collective bargaining institutions. So that would be Denmark, for example, there on the far left, the third from the left. Also Sweden has a large share, and Iceland as well, and Austria. So some of this depends on the types of institutions. And we've done some other analysis that does suggest that collective bargaining does predict the share of collective bargaining or membership in collective bargaining institutions does affect which of these categories people select. And that's all in the working paper. So to conclude, we think that this looks more like panel C than panel B. Now, what we're trying to do is, in this next part, is try to understand whether there's a systematic pattern here. Like, we know that this is seems to be reflective of the way people think, this three-part typology in countries like the US and Switzerland, and a few other countries. But is there a more systematic pattern? And we're also actually kind of testing this neoliberal public hypothesis. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a measure of marketization. So we call it a free market index. We're using indicators from organizations that are themselves promoting neoliberal policies. Okay, so they develop these indicators. The Heritage Foundation, you all may know, and the Fraser Institute are both very conservative, free market oriented organizations. These indicators have been used in other research as well. So that's our main predictive variable. And that is gonna try to answer this question. Well, are countries that are more neoliberal, according to these kinds of free market institutes, do they also have more neoliberal oriented publics? Okay, and the answer to that is going to be mixed, depending upon how you think about what defines neoliberalism. And then we have real GDP per capita also as a benchmark. People are more familiar with that. And it turns out real GDP per capita and the free market index are very highly correlated as well. And then we have a lot of other models in which we have controls, but I'm just going to show you the bivariate results. So on the left here, you have the marketization index on the x-axis and standardized. And what you can see here is that as marketization increases, so does support for the market responsibility options. And these are statistically significant relationships. You also see an increase in the individual responsibility option, which I think is probably more expected. But it is counterintuitive to the neoliberal public hypothesis that as marketization increases, you would have a greater interest in interventions, like non-free market oriented interventions in the market. On the other hand, you might say, oh, this is very neoliberal because support for government redistribution declines with the level of marketization. So this is partly what we're trying to do by disentangling these two parts of the neoliberal package. Okay, so there might be some indicators that suggest that people are against government, but does that mean that they're in support of free market principles? And we don't think the evidence suggests that that's the case, that these two necessarily go together among the public. And then we see very similar patterns with the GDP per capita as the explanatory variable. And then I'm just highlighting just one country, since we're in Great Britain right now. And what we see with Great Britain, I mentioned it earlier, is that it is kind of an outlier itself in the sense that there is higher support for government responsibility relative to the average, predicted average for a country that has the level of marketization that Great Britain has. And then you'll see a similar relationship with GDP per capita. Happy to talk about other countries. You could see France. You could see it in the middle there. You could see that it is very much an outlier. We, like I said, have some ideas about why that is. I can talk about it in the Q&A. Okay, policy preferences. So what we're doing here is we're trying to now link the institutions that people select with policies that they would support as well to reduce inequality. And we're going to focus on policies that reduce or should lead to reductions in earnings and wage inequality only, okay? So we have supplemental policy preference questions, and we fielded these on the surveys in just a small number of countries because there wasn't enough room on the core survey in the 34 countries. So we have the US, plus it turns out this was not planned, but it turns out that there were several countries that also ended up having low levels of support for government redistribution, such as Switzerland and New Zealand, as well as to a certain extent Iceland and Sweden. But then you also have a country like Chile, which is known to be a neoliberal, highly marketized society as well. But I'm going to group those together. I could talk a little bit about the distinctions among them in the Q&A if people are interested. So we have two indices that are going to be our main outcome variable. This one is not policy. The free market ideology index is really a robustness check. It is actually asking about what we consider to be indicators of believing in a free market, such as large differences in income are necessary for America's prosperity. This is the idea that we need inequality because that results in growth, economic growth, and then allowing business to make good profits is the best way to improve everyone's standard of living. Again, this is sort of the idea that a free market is good for everyone. And therefore, inequality will be tolerated as a result of that. This is our main outcome variable, which is an index with 4 questions about the first 2 do not mention government at all, and the second 2 do mention government. The first 2 have to do with, the first one has to do with trade unions. Workers need strong trade unions to protect their interests. And the second one is workers should be represented on the board of directors at major companies. And then the third one has to do with minimum wages. The government should ensure that the wages of low-paying jobs increase as the economy grows. And then the fourth has to do with limiting executive pay. The government should take steps to limit the pay of executives at major companies. And so these are the results. On the y-axis is the outcome variable, these indices, and they're scaled from 0 to 1. And market ideology index as the outcome on the left side, and the market intervention index is the outcome on the right side. And there are a number of controls, individual level controls in these models. And so these are the predicted values of supporting market ideology or supporting market intervention for each of these categories of the first choice question. And then in parentheses on the x-axis, you'll see the share of people who selected those options so that you get a sense of the scale. This is really just what was shown in the bar graph, these percentage distributions. So what we see is that those who select the market responsibility options are more similar to those who select the government responsibility option, and they're significantly less free market oriented than those who select the individual responsibility option. So essentially what we're trying to do here is understand, now, are the people who select those market responsibility options, are they really any different than the other people in the residual, who are the people who select the individual responsibility option? So we really need to demonstrate that the market responsibility, those who select market responsibility, are not just masquerading as otherwise individual, believing in individual responsibility. So here we see, with respect to free market ideology, there is less support for that than among those who select the institutional options than among those who select the individual responsibility options. And then on the right side, we see the converse, which is that there's a larger share of individuals who support market intervention, a higher level of support for market intervention index among those who select the institutional options, government and market, relative to those who select the individual responsibility options. I can just point out here real quickly that you can see here that we have some a priori reasons for why we include high-income individuals along with the other private companies and unions. But you can see that they also empirically, they're more similar to the people who select the private companies, unions, and government options than they are to people who select the individual responsibility options. And basically our a priori reason for putting them in the market responsibility option is because we wanted them to symbolize, there's been a lot of work on perceptions of executive pay and whether it's too much and by how much. And we really think of high income individuals as people who are in positions of power, economic power. And a priori, that is the way that we thought of them as an option. And in terms of the wording, we were just doing another parallel items kind of thing and trying to parallel the wording of the individual low-income individuals as being responsible, kind of using that parallel wording. And then these are the results for the other pulled together, the other 6 countries, and we see a very similar pattern here. I'm going to skip this for now, but I'm happy to go back to more detailed results. Those are detailed results that look at the government responsibility questions separately than the non-government questions and in the free market index. All right, so finally, let's look at whether this is useful in understanding subgroups within a country, within a single country. And so I have circled here the groups that tend to be more conservative. They tend to be the ones that are less supportive of government redistribution. So for example, on the far right, we have political party, partisan ID, and we have Republicans here, and you see they have the lowest share of support for or selecting the government responsibility option at 12%. But you see a quite large share that is supporting the individual responsibility options, roughly the same as those who support the individual responsibility options. So market responsibility options and individual responsibility options are roughly similar among Republicans. Among the other groups, you have much smaller shares that are supporting the individual responsibility options relative to those who are supporting the market responsibility options. So those higher income people, so it's just the top quartile, so not super high income, men and whites also are groups that support government redistribution in lower numbers, but don't support individual responsibility as a residual, but support these market responsibility options as the residual. And these hold up as well in models with more controls. And we also, in general, just see less polarization around just polarization in terms of demographic and other kinds of subgroups explaining support for market redistribution versus more polarization for support for government redistribution. And we've tested this in a number of ways, and that tends to be pretty robust. And as you can see, there's pretty large support for market responsibility and market institutions reducing inequality across the board, right? So it's not just something that is supported among a few groups. Okay, so I am ready to conclude here. So what we're trying to do is, by looking at this residual, we're also in a positive way trying to expand the framework of understanding and measuring redistributive preferences. So we don't want to get rid of the government option, right? But we want to be able to also include potential alternatives that are institutional in nature, but are not the government. And there are various reasons why people may not say that they support government redistribution, but nonetheless will support government policies to reduce inequality. I could talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. But that's a really critical part of this, is that the question itself about government's responsibility to reduce inequality could be the problem, in that it is a question that includes a lot of different factors in it. And we've written in other places some of the problems with that question. So we want to look both at alternative institutions as well as alternative policies. So not only the tax and transfer types of policies, but policies that will reduce inequality in wages and earnings. So pay and benefits regulations, market conditioning policies, collective bargaining, and so on. A little bit more speculative here. Oftentimes the residual, when it's interpreted as representing an individual responsibility orientation, that is used as a demand side explanation. The reason why there isn't more redistribution, the reason why inequality is so high is because this is what the neoliberal public demands. And that is not just representing an ideology of individual responsibility, but it's assuming that there is also support for free market policies. And we think the evidence suggests that that is not entirely correct. Certainly, there is a strong minority of people who may feel that way, but it's much smaller share than we get when we only have a single question about government redistribution. And this is the more speculative part. I think that I think the explanation, even though I study demand side explanations and looking at public opinion, I actually think a much more convincing explanation of why we have such high levels of inequality is really a supply side explanation, which suggests that the reason that we don't have these more policies that would reduce both earnings and disposable income inequality is because we don't have democratic representation within the US that would implement these kinds of policies. And there are lots of reasons to think that. We have a lot of other kinds of survey questions that do, what I presented here is not like new in the sense that we didn't already know that there was a lot of support for, say, increasing the minimum wage. We knew that. It's just, it is not very well integrated from a measurement perspective. It is not well integrated into the models that we have for understanding redistributive preferences. So that's really what we're trying to do, is bring it into a single framework where we can assess these alternatives. And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Professor Leslie McCall. Would you like to come?
Oh, sure.
join
Yes.
me?
Okay. I forgot about that part. I do have a lot of extra slides, so I
Do you
may
want to stay there?
I may come back if I need to. Oh, I can use this from. Okay. Okay. All right.
And we will have, I think, some roving mics. I will take a number of questions together, perhaps. And could I ask you, when you do ask your question, if you feel comfortable to say your name and affiliation? Just as people are gathering their thoughts, could I take the opportunity, as you've been so timely, to ask you to say something about your hunch, your informed hunch about the French outlier?
Yes. Okay. Do you want me to bring up the slide, or is everyone okay with?
We remember it.
You remember? Yeah, it's sitting
by
there in the
itself.
middle. Well, I have been following. So I've actually been following Switzerland too, as well as France, and it. Over the many years I've been working in this area, because both of them have had discussion, public discourse, public sphere, as well as like both the public sphere, journalists and so on, as well as the government debating policies that would reduce executive pay. And a lot of criticism around high executive pay, and also, offshoring of high incomes to other countries, maybe not offshoring, but they could be in Europe. And so this has become a major political issue in those countries, which is not true in all countries at all. And so I think that that is one of the things that ties together these countries. And that would be my explanation for, because if I'm correct, I mean, we know from past work that a country like Denmark, it's very well known that a country like Denmark has low support for government redistribution. It's very obvious why. They have low support for government redistribution. It's because they have a lot of government redistribution already. But they do select the unions option, trade unions option, more than they select, say, the private companies option. So we know that. I don't think that we've known, I have to go back and look at this, but I don't think that we've known in the past that France tends to be one of those countries that has a low share of support for government redistribution. So that's why it was surprising to us. It wasn't surprising to me because of the focus on high executive pay, and there have been a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced over the years to curb that. We have legislation like that in the US. It's very weak, but it's kind of like a say on pay. They're called say on pay laws, so that shareholders can have a say on the pay of executives in public companies, that kind of thing. And that's been debated in Switzerland a lot, as well as implemented in Switzerland, actual caps on referenda that actually ask about implementing caps on executive pay. So longer answer than you probably.
Just to qualify that, the relatively lower support for government intervention is just because they choose in the forced choice response. They're more likely. They may also be very
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Not.
So it's a preference ordering.
Yeah.
And that's extremely important.
Okay.
Right? Because just because you select the market responsibility option doesn't mean you reject all government options, right? You're just preferring that one. And I know people have suggested that in future iterations that these should be ranked. Instead of having a forced choice, we should have them actually ranked. So that's a great suggestion. I wish we had that suggestion before we fielded it. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Let's take a question here.
Good morning. Yeah, Bernard Casey from Frankfurt and London. I'm going to ask about another special case, or maybe it's not a special case, which is Germany, where one has a thing called a social market economy, or one likes to think one has a thing called a social market economy. But I'm interested in the case where you flip, which is what happened in Germany. Of course, I couldn't see those pictures. No, the ones with the line graphs and confidence intervals. The line graph ones later.
Oh.
No, not that one. Sorry, no, not
the
that.
marketization.
Ones with the line graphs. No, never mind. Those ones there. I mean, I can't read from where I am sitting, and I don't suppose anybody else can read from where they are sitting who lies where, unless you are told very explicitly. But the case of Germany is an interesting one because a social market economy had no role for the government in wage setting for a very, very long time. And then all of a sudden, Germany flips to having a minimum wage, which it didn't have before. And so I'm interested in flipping situations like that. When does that happen? Why does that happen? Why is responsibility shifted from one party, to use that term, to another? Thank you.
It's here. D.
And then see. So I don't know if you can all hear me. So it is, I just pointed it out there. It's kind of the reverse of Great Britain. So it's a little bit higher than predicted for selecting the market responsibility option, and a little bit lower than predicted selecting the government responsibility option. So that might also be because of the strong, I mean, I don't know if you would agree that that could potentially be similar to a case like Denmark. I know the policies are not the same, but strong labor market institutions, unions, I know that they've been, of course, weakened, but that with that kind of history that you will see more of a selection of the union. So if we do go back, yeah, actually, Germany does not have. So if you compare like Germany and Sweden has a much higher share that selects unions relative to Germany. So that makes
Just a minute, sorry, look, you're missing the point. What I'm talking about is a flip from a reliance upon unions to a move towards minimum wage setting, which was new. And that was the
right. Okay,
If you-
I
if you allow
understand. And so that might lead to greater support for market regulatory policies that would reduce earnings and wage inequality versus government responsibility. Is that what you're suggesting?
Leslie, if that's okay, I'm Sonia Zmerli. Actually, I pretend to be from France, but I am initially from Germany. And I think I can answer this question.
Okay, great. Thank you.
If you allow me. And maybe I also have a subtle clue as for France. A subtle clue. In terms of Germany, your question was really why did they introduce the minimum wage eventually, right? Because when you compare it with France, France has a minimum wage already for decades, which is called le SMIC. And in Germany, at the beginning of the 2000s, when the Schröder government, which was a social democratic green government, introduced its famous or infamous labor reforms, like Agenda 2010,
Yeah.
it was the trade unions who opposed to introduce a minimum wage at that point. At that point, hang on. And then what followed from that was an increasing share of contracts that were in the sphere of précarité. So they really were struggling with salaries who were paid so low that the Social Democrats really had to struggle with their voters, which eventually led to the firm decision from the government to implement in 2015 a minimum wage, which of course also we needed the trade unions to change opinion, but everybody could see the misery that was falling upon the German, employees. So I think it is not in the data because your question was so specific. I really feel like maybe I can contribute to answer this kind of paradox, if you will. It's a very German specific paradox. Yeah, but that is.
I think this is a conversation for the
Well,
coffee
maybe
to be
this is for the
continued in the
German-
coffee break.
And if you allow me, with regard to France, I'm really struck by the data also with regard to the trade unions, how weak the support is. But what is specific to France compared to Germany, for instance, is the low level of trust in government. So this could be something, although the French are really oriented very much to the state when it comes to interventions and stuff. But at the very same time, they hold very low levels of trust. Like today, this country is stopped. And I'm glad I arrived yesterday. Otherwise, today I could not be here. So this could be something that is kind of interacting also with the data.
Let me just say one thing about trust, because oftentimes people do say, oh, this must indicate that Americans, take the US case, obviously that's my specialization. I'm sorry, I don't know more about Germany. You guys can all do a much better job explaining that than I can. But we have in prior work looked at trust in market institutions as well as in government institutions. And Americans distrust corporations. They actually loathe large corporations. They like small businesses. Small businesses, everyone loves small businesses. But they don't like large corporations. So, do they distrust them as much as they distrust government? No. They distrust government even more than they distrust large corporations. But when we looked at this in the 2014 data, comparing it to Denmark and Sweden, there was higher distrust of corporations in the US than there was in Sweden and Denmark. So yeah, I do think trust is definitely part of this. And I was kind of alluding to it earlier when I said that just the reference to the government in that particular question that everyone uses could be turning a lot of people off. And then they might select other options. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to support a government policy that is very popular. We have lots of social insurance programs. We know social insurance programs are extremely popular, even in the US, right? And those are government based. So so that's why I think this is so much about measurement. And we draw conclusions based on a single or two or three questions, and it's just not adequate to answering the kind of questions that we have about redistributive preferences.
I have another question about measurement, but we have a question here first of all.
Hi, thanks a lot. Daniel Weishaar from University of Cologne, also from Germany, but I won't comment on Germany. So my question is a little bit more basic. So my question is, why did you even chose this framework, like the separation into government, market, individual? Because for me, it seems like everything we have been discussing about is more like at which point the government should actually intervene, right? So if we think about, okay, unions have the responsibility, isn't it then more that the government needs to make the laws, like strike laws, etc., that allow the unions to have this power? Same for private companies. If I say it's private companies that have the responsibility, doesn't this mean that we maybe need to have anti-discrimination laws that like kind of force the companies to take on this responsibility? So I really wonder why this framework was chosen in that way and not in this, at which point the government should intervene.
Thank you. And before you come to that, I will take a question here.
It's actually the same.
You have a mic coming.
It's actually essentially the same question. I had the same question.
Okay.
Like, how do people expect private companies or labor unions to reduce income inequality without government? Or is the idea that we're getting at something, some underlying preference in the abstract?
And you know, that was my question as well. In terms of the measurement and design, how do you know what people are thinking in that moment? Are people saying high income individuals? Is that actually a code for more philanthropic action potentially, or corporations should just be more munificent? Or is there a recognition that all of these things entail government intervention, but not explicit redistribution? Although it's redistributive.
Yes. So yes, we do get this question a lot. And, you know, you could see here in this 2x2 table, there are the market regulatory policies. That's in cell B. And there has been more research on those. So support for minimum wage and support for other kinds of social insurance, say, market conditioning, anti-discrimination policies, which tend to be unpopular. So whereas support for the minimum wage, again, I'm speaking in the US, although I don't think this is probably all that different in other countries, but high support for the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, but generally low support for anti-discrimination policies. So we do have a little bit of that work being done kind of separately from the redistributive preferences literature that focuses on the government. And so that would be a place where the public actors, government actors do intervene, like you say. And in what we're trying to do is also is expose this assumption of free market principles and what that entails. So that would entail, because Americans are also seen to be market loving, right? They don't want government intervention in the economy. And so we want to be able to directly test that. And there's a lot of theory, there's been a lot of research that, especially in political science, but also in economics, that makes that argument. So one of the reasons why we do have this separated out was so that we can get a kind of a pure assessment of what people think that corporations should be doing. And that gives us some sense of whether or not they support free market principles. But then that's why we also have the questions on government regulation, right? So we're pairing them together. So we're seeing, do people support one institution over the other as the lead actor, or maybe the domain? We do think these things are being conflated, right? The actor and the target. So maybe people are selecting market in part because they want labor market inequalities to be reduced. So that's partly what we're trying to tease out with a policy-oriented question. So we don't necessarily, this kind of goes back also to the inductive part of our work. We want to figure out what people are thinking when they don't select the government redistribution. And then we will try to get, we do have very limited space in terms of the questions. But we'll try to get more and more detailed understanding of what that means. We already know, looking at other policy questions, that the people who select the market responsibility option do tend to support a number of government-related policies. So it's a little bit of a contradiction there.
And one way of being anti-government would be pro-union, actually. If you want to take government out of it, that would almost be the most,
right,
non-interventionist.
Right. And the union and the private companies options are in some ways themselves opposites, right?
Yeah.
So they would be different routes to getting at greater wage and earnings inequality, which is also what we want to be focusing on, that target.
I'm going to try and take those two last questions in the back corner very quickly.
Hello, Chris Hoy from the World Bank. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's really helpful heading in this direction of differentiating between, I guess, like the market and the government. But I guess my question comes back to this sense of like people having to order, right, the options, right? Because it's like, I can believe a lot of people would be like, yeah, I'd like to have a job and get paid more. That would be way better than getting like the welfare payment, which is inadequate, right? Or like having to have to pay more taxes or so, so I think there's a challenge here in terms of disentangling sort of like the level of market inequality, right? Versus the actual sort of like role of the government to come in and clean it up. And I mean, I think wouldn't a lot of people's preferences be for low levels of taxation and social policies because the market was already more equitable, like say in Japan or Korea or some of these other settings like that?
I think you should answer that first. I can go now.
Go for it, just because
Okay,
we're very squeezed for time.
My question is is quite related. I think in one of the graphs you showed, or one of the tables you showed, preferences for government and market interventions. And I think many people have an idea that everyone who is for government intervention is also for market intervention, but not necessarily the other way around.
Yes.
And your graphs seem to not show that. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on it, or maybe I misinterpreted. As a second, just as a personal interest, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the policy implementation likelihood of the globally coordinated billionaire tax that's been discussed recently in the last year or two.
I think the last question is very easy to answer. No, but it's reflective of the lack of democratic representation. I think taxing billionaires is probably extremely popular everywhere in the world, but is it going to get implemented? No. Or maybe it is. Maybe I'm being too pessimistic. So I think that so taking the second question first, I think this is what you're referring to, even though it's kind of fuzzy. I don't know if you can see it, but yes, a lot of overlap, and absolutely the way you say it. There are more people who let's see, if you look at the shares here, so there are people who oppose government, like 20%. It's more clear in the bottom. 20% who oppose government responsibility but support market responsibility, which is higher than the reverse. Yep. So it's small, but on the off diagonal, you still have like a good third of people, right, who are accepting of one versus the other. And so maybe a little less than a third, right? So that ends up making a big difference when you're comparing. So when we compared Sweden and the US, for example, the support for Sweden using these measures hardly changed at all. Because there was so much more overlap, or just simply because so much people supported government redistribution. But in the US, it makes a big, if you add that 20% point or that 20 percentage points, that's a lot given the base in the US. So yes, I take your point, and I think that both points I think are right on target. And in terms of the question about actually, could you just say it one more time? Let me know exactly what you want me to to respond to, because you said a number of things that I agree with, but I wasn't sure I got the question.
Yeah, so I guess very succinctly, the question was, aren't people's preferences for market redistribution, that's kind of a sequencing thing, right? So you're
what?
asking people in an
Sequencing.
ordering, right? What would they prefer? It's like, well, obviously you'd prefer that, say, people got higher wages, right? So then you didn't need to have as much taxes, that sort of transfer system and welfare and, like this,
Yes.
this sort of sequencing of these two things makes it harder to disentangle them side by side.
Yes, no, that's a great point. I don't have a good response to that because it is kind of a counterfactual. There might be other countries in which that is the case. Like I think of Denmark, which is not exactly that. Like the lack of support for government redistribution is actually because they already have a lot of government redistribution. I don't think it's actually because they have fair, or it could be, right? Because they have fair earnings and wages in the labor market and less inequality there. So I'd have to think of a case, but yes, I think that's very consistent. Just speaking about the US, that would be very consistent with the US case. People very highly supportive of this type of redistribution in the labor market, and then coupling that with what looks to be like the anti-government, small government approach. I will say, though, that that policies like, if you ask a single question about increasing taxes on the rich, those are very popular across the board. And the two huge tax cuts that have been passed in the US this year and in 2017, both under Trump, hugely unpopular. So it doesn't really matter that it's unpopular. They get implemented anyway. That I know people will then ask, well, then why do people vote for them? So, well, that's a whole other question that has to do with populism. And I don't think, I think it's related to this, but it's not the same thing. How people vote is not the same as what kinds of policy preferences they have. So it's not as if even looking at the tax questions now, not your counterfactual, but looking at them now, there is a lot of support for not taxes in general, but increasing taxes on the wealthy and high income people. And people were so surprised in the US a few years ago when Senator Elizabeth Warren had proposed a tax on wealth. And all of the public opinion polls of the various newspapers did, and there wasn't a lot of polling on wealth taxes at that point. But there was a lot of support, even among Republicans, for a tax on wealth. So these are things that I think are they're not on the table because government elites are not considering them, not because the public isn't supportive of them.
We have gone a little over time. Apologies for that, but we did end with taxing the rich. So it wasn't a bad way to end the session. And we have 2 days to talk about all the other questions that were in the room. Could you join me, please, in thanking Professor Leslie McCall?